Here we go. Hi, you should be hearing the audio now. My name is Nick Sakurai. I'm the Director of Leadership Initiatives and Associate Director here in the LGBT Equity Center at the University of Maryland. I'm really excited to be with you today. If you've joined the room, if you want to, up to you. If you'd like to introduce yourself on the chat box, we're really interested in what sorts of questions or suggestions or just concerns that you might have. We'll try to address some of those throughout as we go into the panel discussion, but we can also have a specific Q&A towards the end. But I do hope that you'll ask questions throughout. We may not answer them immediately as you ask them, but please feel free to ask. So with that, welcome. This is a session on LGBTQ plus inclusion in the classroom. And so the objective of this is a panel discussion. And so our objective is that we'll be discussing and learning from our experiences, challenges, and thinking about practices for creating a more inclusive classroom environment for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and beyond folks on campus, right? So our target is to think about faculty, instructors, teaching assistants on campus, although we also know that many folks are not necessarily in full-time faculty roles who've joined us today, that many folks are staff or graduate students who maybe have some instructional role or maybe who oversee or work with instructors in some sort of way. So we hope that this will be relevant to you, but I'd also mention that this session won't cover every single thing that you might want us to cover, although we hope that we can be responsive and engaging with whatever questions or things that you bring to the table. But we want you to see this as a starting point and not an end point. And with that, we're going to move into our panel discussion. So again, to introduce myself, my name is Nick Sakurai. I go by they and them pronouns. I work here in the LGBT Equity Center, and I'm joined by three really awesome folks who've volunteered to be part of this conversation today. I have with me Tat Caicedo, I have Alice Donlan, Dr. Donlan, and Ayush Gupta, Dr. Gupta. So I'm hoping if each of you all could maybe introduce yourselves, say a little bit about where you're coming from on campus, and anything else that you'd like to share. Who would like to start?
Sure. My name is Alice Donlan. I am the Director of Research at the Teaching and Learning Transformation Center on campus. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as queer, and I've taught classes on campus like lifespan development, adolescent development, research methods, and introduction to statistics.
Excellent.
Hello, I'm Tat Caicedo. I'm a student at the University of Maryland. I'm in my senior year, and I'm studying early childhood and special education. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm agender and bisexual, and I advocate for bilingual students' rights in my organization, Partners in Print.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ayush Gupta. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a Keystone instructor in the College of Engineering, and I teach an engineering design course. I'm also a research assistant professor in physics, and I do some research in how people learn physics, how they learn engineering, how can we change the culture of our departments for better learning for students. I identify as gay and queer, and I have been thinking more about like how I can sort of like make my own classroom space more inclusive, and I think I'm at the tip of starting to learn a little bit about it, and that's about where I am at.
Great. Thank you all for being here today. So what does, we're talking about this topic of LGBTQ plus inclusion in the classroom, and what does that mean to you, and why does that matter?
So for me, I think it's just the recognition that LGBTQ plus people are already in our classrooms. Like, we're already there. And if people decide not to say anything at all and not to do anything at all, that's actually taking a position one way or the other. So if we're ignoring people in the classroom, that's taking a position. So we might as well try to do something more positive and try to do something more inclusive because we're here.
Mm. Mm.
That's very true. I think as a teacher, you need to, like, it depends on what your curriculum and what you're teaching, but if it's an English class, like, make sure you choose books that have a big span of different types of people. Don't have just one day, and like goes for all teachers. Don't have one day dedicated to just queer LGBT people because that makes it very othering, and it's just like one day and you're done. It needs to be embedded into the curriculum to normalize LGBT people.
Mm-hmm.
Make you ask like why LGBT inclusion? Why does it matter? And I'm thinking a little bit from personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so like classrooms aren't places where some sort of like clinical learning takes place. This is a place where human beings are coming in contact with each other. And so unless we create the classroom as a space where people can bring their whole person to the table, it'll inherently be an oppressive space. And that's how I experienced most of my classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
And being in those classrooms sometimes was really difficult because you can't be who you are, and it's not a matter of like, in some sense you can, because sort of like LGBT identity is not about sexuality. It's about how you perform lots and lots of aspects of your life. And heteronormative and cisgender classrooms end up spaces where a lot of students have to leave all of those aspects of themselves out. And not just LGBT students, anybody who doesn't fit into very, very narrow definitions of a binary gender, of a heteronormative, anything that is falling even a little bit outside of that line needs to be switched out, right? And that creates for space that is not conducive for sort of like being whole. And ultimately, what we are seeing through research is that it's not a space that is conducive to learning. And so I think that's why it matters. And so personally, for it matters because it's like connects to my own experience, and then reflecting back on that, I wouldn't want other students to have those kinds of experiences.
You're making me reflect a lot too on my own experiences of the classroom, and I have maybe a few of my own examples I might share and ask if you have ones that you want to share. And now I'm not naming names here, but I've been in situations where I took a course, and the first day I walked into the room, I hadn't met anyone, and somebody immediately looked at me and said, "Oh, great, a big, strong man. Can you help me carry some boxes from the car?" And there were other people already in that classroom who could also be asked to help. And I don't identify as a man, but it was immediate that in meeting an instructor that that this was like the gender role thing was going to play out immediately, and that really shaded, I think, the whole course for me in some ways. I'm wondering if you have other similar experiences, or things that you've encountered, or that you've heard students talking about that concerns them in some of the classroom dynamics.
So, as a student who studies early childhood and special education, I learned that the classroom has to be a safe place for the students, which means that we need to be accepting of all identities that are in the classroom, and by doing that, it creates a safe place. But I find that teachers, even the teachers who are teaching me these things, like making the classroom a safe place, aren't making it a safe place for me. I go in there and immediately, because my class is all of cis women except for me, they introduce the class with "Hello, ladies," and with that immediate introduction to the class, my brain kind of turns off, and it's like difficult for me to focus to the rest of the lecture because being misgendered all the time takes a toll on me feeling safe, feeling comfortable, and wanting, like it's difficult to learn when you don't feel like you can be yourself and you don't feel accepted and included in the classroom. And so as a teacher who's going to work with students, I want to be able, like, I know from experience that this is not good to like just assume gender, assume people's pronouns, assume people's sexuality, because it's always like a default that people are cisgender and heterosexual, and we need to be, I I don't know. We just shouldn't assume things because it really hurts people who don't fit in those categories.
I think also, just as a positive example, something that was really good for me in a classroom that was very subtle. But I was in a statistics class, and I remember this was the first time that there was a problem example, a classroom example, where it was about a queer couple, but the content was not about anything queer. They just happened to be a queer couple in the example, and we weren't learning about queer studies or data specifically for queer people. They just, in the background, the example was a more inclusive example. And because the instructor chose just a normal example, inclusive example, I knew that if I needed to go to office hours and talk about something that was going on, and I happened to drop like, oh, and my girlfriend and I are going to do this, that instructor probably wasn't gonna panic on me or be incredibly awkward on me. And that subtle cue, just from using that more inclusive example, helped me know that I could communicate with that instructor without kind of having in the back of my mind like,
I should say my name. So this is Ayush, and meaning this conversation is making me think sometimes, like, when classrooms become these very sort of like heteronormative cisgender spaces, it from my experience, sometimes I'm reflecting back on the amount of work that is needing to be done in order to enter that space, something that Todd also mentioned. And so, for example, in everyday context, I pass as male, but I might not want to perform every day as that. I like putting on lipstick, I like putting on eyeshadow, I like putting on eyeliner. But if I want to enter the classroom when I was a student, I have never ever done that, because it would be a terrifying notion to present as male and walk into the classroom with eyeliner on. What would the other students say? What would the other faculty say? Would my group mates, still want to work with me? Um, Now that I'm a faculty, I find it much more easier to transgress gender in little ways. But as a student, but the amount of work that goes on into thinking and deciding whether you want to do this or not, whether you want to do that or not, and that leads to additional work that queer students are doing, and that's not fair.
I'm interested, this is Alice speaking, I'm interested in what you just said about it was, you find it a little bit easier to do as a faculty member than as a student. Is there a power piece there, or as a faculty member you have more power than you did when you were a student, or what is that, what has changed for you?
I guess, meaning a couple of things. One is definitely there is more power as a faculty. Second, I think is just the number of years. So as years have gone by, I have become more and more open to saying that, hey, I'm going to do certain kinds of things, and if there are consequences to that, I'm just going to take it, because all of these little moments add up to some sort of like culture change. And if each one of us doesn't do a little tiny action, then change will never happen. So it's like a little tiny action that you do, cognizant that there might be consequences, but also knowing that those little actions are probably creating a climate that is also a little more open. And so I think with age, I have just become sort of like less concerned with consequences.
It's interesting having this particular panel because I think we all identify somewhere within LGBTQ plus identities, and I know that our audience may not, depending on who is listening in. Um, but I think, that's its own conversation. We could easily have our own 1 hour session just about what it's like as an instructor to navigate the classroom as an LGBTQ plus person, and I find that that can be its own challenge because, um, whether it's concerns about just will students respect me, right? If they know X, Y, or Z, and when does that become clear, and how does that become clear? Because it's not like it depends on who you are. I mean, maybe some instructors give their own biography and say more about themselves on the first day, but what kinds of facts do you include in that? But there was a time when I did a presentation, and afterwards a student came up to me and said, you're the first person I've ever seen in a position of power who uses they them pronouns, who's non-binary. And I'm a non-binary student, and that was so powerful for me that for the first time in my life I saw somebody in some position of power that's like me. And it moves me just thinking about it now. And I know for each person, kind of navigating that is different. I'm wondering any other thoughts you have, maybe advice for folks who happen to be LGBTQ plus, in thinking about disclosure or pronouns, or how that these things, if you bring them up, how you've navigated that in classroom settings.
This is Alice, and this is something that I think about a lot, about whether to disclose and how to disclose and when to disclose. And I think where I am now is, it's just sort of the same. I treat the classroom sort of the same as I treat my normal life, where if something comes up and somebody asks me about my weekend, and I say, well, my girlfriend and I went to wherever, if it comes up naturally, then I just talk about it as it comes up. But I don't, on the first day of class, I don't say, hi, my name is Alice and I'm queer, and here's details about my personal life, just because I don't really talk about my personal life very much as an instructor overall. And I've seen and that's gone kind of two different ways, where sometimes it'll come up in the class and that'll be part of the class, and other times there's been sort of, I'm interested to hear what you think about this. I feel like there's sometimes a little bit of a benefit when students might be more willing to say something to me that they would not say if they knew that I'm queer. So, for example, when I was teaching lifespan development, we were talking about LGBTQ issues in the class, and there's a period where we were just having discussion, and a student said to me, well, women become lesbians because they get rejected by men. And so we talked about that. We dove into that, and we, tried to unpack that and talk about, preferences and where does that come from? How do you know what you prefer or don't prefer? How do you know what feels good to you or doesn't feel good to you? And those kinds of things. And it ended up being a very positive conversation and a very interesting conversation. But I don't know if that student would have said such a frankly offensive thing to me if they had known that I identify as queer. They might have been afraid of offending me if my identity had kind of been on the table. So I don't know.
So
it's something that
pluses and minuses.
Yeah, it's
both
something
ways.
that I think about a lot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Just how you would navigate. This is Nick. The question was just how you think about navigating the classroom as somebody who may be LGBTQ plus.
So, this is Tat Caicedo. As someone who's agender, and pronouns are really important, because I the way I present, people would assume that I'm a girl, and that is a very wrong assumption and not fair. Using they them pronouns is very important to me. So I'm pretty much out on campus to everyone that I know, but still they don't really use the right pronouns. As someone who's trying to get a job after I graduate in the education field, they don't discriminate, they say, against trans and gender identity and sexual orientation, but I'm still kind of worried about trying to get a job. And so what I've decided is that I'm just going to not say anything until I get the job and then be very myself. And it's very difficult to not be able to be yourself at first. And like cis heteronormative people don't have to worry about that. They can go to the job worrying about like, oh, am I qualified enough? Do I have a good reference? Where I have to worry, are they going to discriminate? Like, even if they're not like really discriminate, like they can't say they are, but maybe they just decide that I'm not good enough for like that reason. It really helps that I have a really good supportive friend group that use my pronouns that I can go home to every day to do that. And I know not everyone has that. So like just finding at least one person that you can find who's like your safe person that always uses your pronouns, can validate you. It really helps being able to go through the day. And because I get misgendered a lot, even though like everyone, they should know my pronouns by now.
This is Ayush. As an instructor, I would say things have really changed over the years. So initially, I think I was much more sort of like conscious and concerned to make sure that, none of the personal life enters the classroom. Over time, the two things have happened. One is I've just become much more comfortable this being out there in the world, and two is my philosophy has changed, where I don't see a STEM classroom as a place that is hermeneutically or clinically sealed away from the rest of life. And so what has happened is like, and so over the years, it would happen that some student would suddenly discover that, hey, hey, your name was on the out list or something like that. And I would realize that the world didn't fall apart, right? And so over time, it became more a part of my classroom. And here's an incident. Like one time when introducing myself, I just happened to mention that, hey, there are various tidbits if anybody has any questions. And somebody asked me about something you've done that is interesting. I said I was in a documentary, and I didn't expect the next question, which was like, what was the documentary about? And then I was like, oops, because it was about a queer South Asian experience. And so I ended up saying that. And once again, the world didn't fall apart. And so over time, I've realized that students are can respectfully deal with their instructors' identities, including queer identities. And this sort of like emboldened me to do a little bit more. And so then the semester that this conversation happened about the documentary, the next semester I introduced sort of like myself with pronouns. And when we would first sort of like form student teams, because it's an engineering design course, I would model how a person can introduce themselves with pronouns, and there'll be space in their name labels where they could write their pronouns, but I wouldn't make it mandatory, right? Because I don't want people to, feel sort of like that there is like a protocol that they have to stick to absolutely. But I would give them examples to say that, hey, here's how you can quickly say it. Here's how you can say a little bit more about it if you want to, and then open up the space for different team members to introduce themselves as like a little tiny way where, as an instructor, I'm bringing in my sort of like how I perform my gender into the space, but also using that as a way to model for students that this should be a gender inclusive space.
Why don't we talk about pronouns a bit more since we're on the topic? What do you all suggest as good practices, issues that can come up when you're trying to talk about pronouns? What has come up for you?
So as a student, who uses they them pronouns, I send all my professors in the beginning of the year my pronoun. Like I introduce myself. My name is Takai Seto. Sorry, this is Takai Seto. My name is Takai Seto, and I use they them pronouns. I'm a student in your class, and stuff like just like basic info about myself, and to see how they will respond. And I've gotten so many different responses, like from people who are like, some of my professors just are like so confused that they responded make sure you put that on your test so I know who you are. And I was like, these are my pronouns, so this is how I want to be referred. And it was just very confusing. And that professor didn't even use my pronouns correctly. So I think she was very confused. And it's also like I feel like uncomfortable always having to explain it to everyone because it's very draining. So it'd be nice if like my professors could do some research so I don't always have to be explaining how to use my pronouns. Because I had an English professor tell me that they them pronouns don't exist. As singular they them pronouns don't exist, and I was like, yes they do. You use them in your everyday life. Like when you go to a grocery store and you're telling your friend about your trip to the grocery store and you're talking about the person who checked you out, but you don't like identify, like you don't know their gender, so you're like, yeah, I bought some grapes and they checked me out. They checked, like they gave me bags or something like that, and like that's one person and you're using they them pronouns for them. Like you can do that for me. And yeah, I've had a lot of pushback from professors, but I have had one good experience with a teacher. She um she was all about like being inclusive in the classroom, and so I was like, maybe I can trust her. Like her inclusion wasn't the best. It was very like surface level inclusion, like make sure girls can do this too, and like don't just give boys all the things that have to do with strength. And like hello, instead of like saying he for when like using pronouns, she would say she and he, and I like decided this is making me uncomfortable. She could just be using they. I sent her an email saying the only reason I'm reaching out to you is because I feel like you are an understanding person, and I hope that you'll understand why this actions that you've been doing have made me uncomfortable. And I gave her like examples of how she could change her language, because she was actually the teacher. Well, there's actually a bunch of teachers who do this, but she was one of the teachers who would say, hello, ladies. And I gave her examples of what she could do to change. Like, instead of saying, hello, boys and girls, say, hello, class, hello, everyone, hello, y'all. And I also showed her how she could use they, them pronouns. So, like, she kind of slowly changed her language. She still messed up a couple times, but, like, I felt so much better being in that class. Like I was able to continue listening to her lecture because I could tell that she was trying to include me. Yeah.
This is Alice, and I really am interested in your story, in part because it also illustrates that people mess stuff up and people make a mistake, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the semester is over or the conversation is done. You know, I have misgendered people and I have used the wrong pronouns, and I try to apologize and I try to, do better and think about it and try to, question my own assumptions. But certainly I don't get things right 100% of the time. And people don't get things right 100% of the time with me either. But the hope is that, one mistake or 20 mistakes, you can still try to do better, and you can still try to learn more and do some research on your own. You don't necessarily have to ask students to explain things to you. I mean, Wikipedia exists. So I think it's important to remember that nobody's perfect, and that doesn't mean that you have ruined a semester because you made a mistake. You could do some aftercare, you can do some listening, and you can try to improve things, especially if a student or a colleague is willing, like you are willing, to come forward and say, hey, this is my experience, and here's why this didn't work for me, and here's some suggestions. I mean, that's so helpful to be able to move forward in your own practice.
So this is Ayush. I want to add to that. I think from the story that I heard Tat say, one of the things that is coming to my mind is that people can improve, definitely, like Alice was saying, but I don't think it should be the responsibility of marginalized students to educate those in power. A STEM instructor, for example, or we would not say that, oh, it is taking too much time as an instructor to learn the content of the course that we are teaching, to read an extra book on it. But somehow, when it comes to educating ourselves about the whole lives of students, suddenly it becomes like as if it's an added burden. And I'm going to say that that should not be the case. Instructors should have the responsibility, irrespective of which content area they're teaching, to educate themselves. It is their responsibility to educate themselves. It's our responsibility as instructors to educate ourselves, and to not have um, marginalized students, in this case queer students, having to teach us about this. Um, so that is one thing that I'm strongly thinking, is that we need to own this. We need to, as instructors, we need to stand up and put time and energy into basically being better human beings, and that will hopefully translate into being better instructors. As far as pronouns is concerned, a couple observations. I found that one, students have, or for students who know about pronouns walking into the classroom, have really appreciated bringing in the use of pronouns in groups. And so this has ended up showing positively in the comments for course evals. So for anybody who is thinking how will it show up, I have an n equal to 1 anecdote that, hey, it is possible that this has actually helped in creating a positive atmosphere in the classroom. Second observation is that oftentimes students who haven't thought about gender at all, and what that means is most often these are folks who have sort of like lived within the dominant gender, and so it becomes sort of like invisible, right? And so if they haven't thought enough about it, sometimes it feels to them a little bit strange, like that I should say that, oh, I use he, him pronouns, or I use she, her pronouns. And so for that, what I've sort of like recognized as a way to deal with it is, when I model what to say, I would say my name, I'll say my pronouns, and then I'll model to them what they could say. And so I could say something like, hey, this can, if this is new to you and you haven't thought a lot about it, it can go pretty fast. You can say my name is X and I use he, him, she, her pronouns, right? Um, or if you've thought about it, then you can think about saying more if you want to, or something else. But basically normalizing it so that students who haven't thought about it aren't suddenly feeling like, oh, am I doing something really strange, right? So giving them language models so that they can engage with this, because if they are feeling awkward about it, then they will avoid it. And if they avoid it, now suddenly I have, within teams, people where, four people haven't used their pronouns, they've only introduced themselves by their names. And then the fifth person who wants to use, say, they, them pronouns, or, present says male but wants to use she, her pronouns, now suddenly they are on the spot. Because the ones who have gone previously haven't introduced their pronouns at all. So it's as if they are the ones who are bringing it in the conversation. And so it's important that the conversation is normalized so that even folks who are doing this for the first time actually do it.
Mm. Mm. While we're talking about this, I think, in a minute I probably want to segue towards good practices, but this may also be a moment just to talk about some resources. I'm looking at Alice to maybe tell us a little bit about TLTC, and I can probably say some things about what we have available in the Equity Center that may just be about larger pedagogical issues of how faculty can do, what Ayush is saying, which is to really engage, that it's a key component of teaching, that it's not just the content area, but also the knowing your students, or how do you deliver the content, and those kinds of things.
Sure. So at the Teaching and Learning Transformation Center, we work directly with instructors, both graduate instructors and faculty, and anybody who's teaching on campus, and staff, to talk about ways to improve their teaching practice, including ways to make classrooms more inclusive. We have a workshop series that's focused more on issues of diversity and issues of inclusion, that just talks about how students have very diverse lived experiences. So not just LGBTQ issues, but issues surrounding race or religion or just background, other background variables, and how to kind of treat your student as a person, as a whole person, as they come into your classroom. We've also just released we did a workshop, but also there's a website on addressing sensitive issues in the classroom. So, if something happens in the news, if there's a world event that is very difficult or that disproportionately affects some students more than others, we have some guidance on ways that teachers can choose to address or not address. We have a couple of different ways that teachers can choose to deal with difficult life events in their classroom if they feel that it's appropriate. That's actually at our website, so tltc.umd.edu/discussions, and there's a good amount of information there. We also provide one-on-one faculty consultations, so anybody who wants to come in and just talk about issues related to teaching, we do anything basically related to teaching at all, but also very happy to talk about issues related directly to LGBTQ+ students.
Awesome. This webinar is part of a series of webinars, and so earlier this semester we did one that was on LGBTQ+ terminology and concepts. We did one that was on trans-inclusive language and practices, and we did a third one on LGBTQ+ people of color, students of color. And so those all three were recorded. I'd say particularly the first two, there may be more content as well on the specifics of wrapping our minds around pronouns and what kinds of pronoun sets exist and good practices and how to introduce. So that may be also a useful resource for people. Our center is also planning a launch of a new ongoing campaign through Rainbow Terrapin Network called the Trans Awareness Project. And that's something where we hope we can also provide more information on good practices. Some of that may be physical resources like buttons that have pronouns on them for those who are maybe running an event or something special and you want to distribute these kinds of buttons that help raise awareness or let other people know messages like pronouns matter or just even specific pronouns on some of the buttons. So that's something that we hope will be coming available in the coming months, so some things to look forward to. And on that note, I'm wondering what you think are some other any other resources you might want to share that have been helpful for you, but also what are some other good practices beyond pronouns? I know that's a huge area we can spend even more time on, but what are some other issues that come up or things that people should be aware of?
So in one of my classes, we learn about like families and how to work with families, and there was just we spent one day on LGBT families, and it was like one day out of the whole semester, and the way it was taught, it was like even if these families go against your beliefs, you still have to do what's right. Like you still have to be a good teacher and teach the kids like you would teach any other kids. And I don't know, just sitting in the classroom, it was just very othering, the way that they presented the information and the way that it was just like, one day let's learn about these people and it's over with. And also the fact that trans people didn't even like exist or like come to their minds when thinking that there could be parents who are trans. And the way that they talked about these parents, it was like 2 cis women and 2 cis men. So it wasn't very diverse at all. Just basically putting LGBT people into the curriculum just as much as you would as cis heteronormative people. Also making sure that the people that you choose are also diverse, because there's not just one LGBT narrative. There's people from different backgrounds, like your race, your ethnicity, your class, and religion all like make like everybody's story different. So don't just choose like one white LGBT author and like leave it at that. Make sure it's more like there just needs to be more.
Yeah, this is Nick, and I think that
Sorry,
that seems a common issue too, which is that when LGBT examples are brought up, they're also very often they feel like very normative LGBT examples, like gay, white, male, you know, middle class, upper middle class kinds of examples. And so even just thinking about diversifying within LGBT curricula may be important as well.
So this is Ayush. Thinking about like classroom and how to construct the classroom, and most of what I'm going to say is sort of like more relevant to STEM classrooms. Maybe it goes beyond what my experience is only in STEM classrooms. And so I'm thinking, like, if we are thinking about how to support LGBT students, my sense would be that we want to zoom out and think more broadly. And so the question should first be, how do we create an open, inclusive, respectful space in the classroom? And if a classroom is functioning as truly an open, inclusive, respectful space, then to some extent it will be a supportive place for LGBTQ folks, because my definition of open would include being open and aware of and attending to those issues. But it'll also include being open and attentive to and inclusive of issues of race, of gender, of socioeconomic status, of whether, for example, a student missed an assignment or is turning that late because they had to do, 6 extra hours of work the night before in order to support their education. And if I'm not supportive of that kind of experience, then how can I be supportive of somebody's LGBTQ plus experience? So I cannot sort of like create these silos and boundaries. And so we really need to embrace our students as whole people. And that just doesn't mean embracing their queer side. It means their queer side and their racial side and issues of gender and class and families. All of that needs to come into consideration when we are creating these spaces. And if we are wanting to create this open space, we cannot wait till some student comes up and says, hey, you should attend to my pronouns. We have to start on day one or earlier, because we need to set the tone that this classroom is a different kind of space, because students are too often used to classrooms being oppressive spaces. And so if we want a different space, we need to start on day one to create that openness, create that inclusion through lots of little different actions, which will involve sort of like, say, being attending to who's speaking in the classroom discussion, who's not. How do we create a multitude of ways for students to participate? For example, students who don't want to stand up and speak in front of class of 40, can I create alternative ways for them to still participate in the discussion, right? Those are sort of like tiny little steps that also contribute to inclusion. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you want to create an open, inclusive space in the classroom, it will require us to step back and re-examine every single thing that we do in the classroom. It's not going to be easy, but then easy does not equals justice. Doing the work of justice is a lot of difficult work, and many times it will require us as instructors to really look at our past experience and say that I have been racist, I have been sexist, I have screwed up, but I'm willing to learn. And I'm going to put in the energy and the time that is required for that learning to take place, so that I can create an open, inclusive classroom that will support students in their wholeness. And I don't think we can isolate and support LGBTQ plus identities if we don't also support all of those other aspects.
This is Alice, and kind of following up with what Ayush is saying, I think there are also ways to promote trust in a classroom. Research shows that there's ways to promote trust in a classroom that don't necessarily have anything to do with students' identities, but do relate to trust. So, for example, setting clear expectations in the class, being very communicative and direct with how you're expecting assignments to be structured and when due dates are, and providing clear, timely feedback, and making sure that the instructor always does what they say they're going to do. If you say you're going to post the slides every Sunday night before the week starts, then really do that and make sure that you are being trustworthy so that your students, you do develop that sense of trust. And those are things that are, they're just academic practices, but they can create a more positive climate and make it so that students might be more likely to disclose to you their needs or share with you if something has gone wrong, or believe that you care enough to adapt a practice to be more inclusive. So we can start from things that might feel, especially if this is, if dealing with LGBTQ plus inclusion in your class is a little bit new for some people. I think there are also just some things that you can do with your current pedagogy that create a positive climate that can then help you kind of move into a more inclusive space more generally.
This is Tat Caicedo. As an educator, you need to be reflective in everything that you do each day. As you go home, you need to decide, how did that class go? What could I do to improve myself? As an educator, you're always learning. As a person, you're always learning. You should always try to strengthen and grow as a person, and by doing that, you can reflect on how things went. So as a constant learner, I believe that you should do some research on groups that are different than your identities, because then you can get more information without having those groups needing to talk to you and say, this is what you did wrong, this is how I feel uncomfortable with you saying this. You doing your research is kind of like a proactive way of making sure that the press groups don't have to reach out to you. So I wouldn't have to have gone up to my professor and email her about how I felt uncomfortable with her addressing the class as hello ladies. And one of the websites that I like to use to learn more about groups that are different than my own identities is Everyday Feminism, because they have easy to read sections for race, class, LGBT, specifically trans, ability, and everything you need. They have it in videos and they have it written form. And I'm someone who has difficulty reading, and the way they break it up is in bullet points, so I know what is the main idea, and then if I have the time I can read more that explains why it's really important. And then I try to improve myself by making sure I'm aware of what I'm doing and reflect on how I behave around other people.
Thank you. This is Nick. I'm just going to reiterate, I think, some of the things that I'm hearing. I think there's a lot, right? So one is power dynamics matter, and recognizing identity and power dynamics is one step in this process. Another is that, humans matter, and it isn't just knowledge and content, that we're all people in these processes. A third was that, the philosophy of the space and what we're trying to create through a classroom is really important to all of this. That said, I'm hearing that this really impacts all parts, right? That could be looking at what you do to prepare as an instructor, what you put on the syllabus. If you have language in the syllabus that addresses different kinds of needs and communities, right? We often put something about disability access, usually because we're told that we have to put something about disability access. But there are other things that many of us also include on our syllabi because we think they're important. Or at least something as a resource for a student. There's especially how you start off the classes and how you start to build community. And I would suggest that, that more folks think about creating community agreements for classrooms. It's not, I see it a lot in workshops, but strangely that doesn't necessarily carry over into classes that run for 15 weeks. Even though you're spending lots of time in conversation, you're not always having a conversation about how that we have conversations or what we can expect from each other, and how that we can continuously revisit that, right? So it's not just we said here's the rules and don't break them, but also like we want to be in a meaningful conversation. Looking at the curriculum, looking at the readings, looking at the examples, looking at the language that we use. And I don't know if it was explicitly brought up, but looking at evaluations and assignments and what that creates for people. And another area I think we also didn't talk in a lot of depth on is handling or supporting students in crisis as well. That when you do create a relationship where people can say, hey, this is what's going on for me and why I'm struggling a lot right now, being open to obviously like a student could write X, Y, and Z in their assignment or could have a conversation with you after class or as a mentor, and what does that look like as well. I hope I've captured the slew of things that kind of go into a course, because it sounded like what I'm hearing from the panel is, a lot of this is about developing a lens, right? Developing a lens for inclusion, for diversity, for justice, and being able to think about these things more deeply and applying that lens to all parts of teaching and of courses. With that, I want to turn to any questions that folks listening in have, and I see one now, which was someone in the Department of Communications asks, how would you try to be more inclusive in a general education class? I teach a public speaking course with such a diverse set of perspectives and majors. My experience is there are a wide range of assumptions, myself and the students. Should a general education class be different as an inclusive space, especially given that it's one of the first few classes the students take?
I think it'd be a great opportunity to for the students to learn. Since it is the first class they take, then you can be their jumpstart into being an inclusive student and person. I believe that, I don't know how, like, if you do introductions or how big this class is, but I'm assuming that you as a teacher introduce yourself in the beginning of the semester, and you could start off like, I'm sure you'd say your name, and as soon as you say your name, also say your pronouns, because that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the students. And they might ask you, why are you saying your pronouns after that? Or they might not even know what pronouns are. You can do a sentence explanation of what it is and how it is important to people, because it helps identify who they are. And then if the students feel comfortable, like if you do introductions, the students can also say their names and pronouns if they feel comfortable doing that.
This is Ayush. Instead of thinking about like very specific things that can be done, I want to think a little more broadly about gen ed courses. And what I'm thinking is that gen ed courses, like oftentimes when we as instructors are thinking about our own course, but not necessarily of the ecosystem within which that course is located. And as an engineering instructor, though, I've seen how gen ed courses really impact students in the STEM courses. Oftentimes, if I bring up pronouns, for example, the place where some of the students, those who have sort of like engaged in that practice before, it would be in a gen ed course. If we talk about some kind of issues of gender and how microaggressions, implicit bias, when we raise those in an engineering design classroom, it'll be often in a gen ed course where they would have encountered those concepts. And so I think that gen ed courses can be, like, at least are right now playing a vital role in helping our students grow up and participate responsibly in the disciplinary cultures that they will exhibit. STEM courses are the ones that are falling behind, and we need to learn a lot on how to do these kinds of things in STEM courses. So I would say that gen ed courses, are playing a role, and they should continue to play even a bigger role in thinking responsibly about how to almost like create expectations that students demand that our instructional spaces are open, they are inclusive, and they just expect that as a norm, so that they are not the ones who are sort of like, at some mercy that, oh my God, it was so great to have a classroom that was inclusive. It should be the norm that the classrooms are open and inclusive, and anybody who's not doing that, they are the ones who should be answerable.
So this is Nick. We're running out of time, but what I would ask is if any of our panelists want to give any brief closing thoughts, takeaways.
This is Tat Caicedo, and my takeaway is don't assume pronouns and don't assume gender, because I like to wear dresses, but I do not use she, her pronouns or he, him pronouns. I use they, them pronouns. So listen to me when I say my pronouns and respect that. And as a teacher, it's your responsibility to make the place safe, and so educate yourself so your students don't have to.
Thank you.
This is Alice. I would echo what Todd said, and I would also say, communities get to name themselves, movements get to name themselves. Words change over time, so something that may have been completely acceptable and welcomed 10 years ago might not be the word that that community is choosing to use now, and that is the community's right, and it's an individual's right to decide how they want to identify and what are the right words for that person. So I think just remembering to be a little bit flexible and willing to, hear something new and try, it can be cognitively challenging. If you're used to a word, it can just take some cognitive effort to change that word in your head. But just be willing to put in that work, be willing to do it wrong and apologize when you do it wrong, but be willing to hear when a community is changing their words. I think a really easy way to show respect for that community is to adapt your words to what they're trying to put out in the world.
This is Ayush. Quick point. I think that as instructors, we are designing human experience, not just teaching a topic. And so I think my final comment would be that as instructors, we really need to learn how to do that. It is absolutely not sufficient to be content experts.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. I have a couple brief slides in closing here. A few key resources, certainly the LGBT Equity Center's website, lgbt.umd.edu. You also note that there's two other URLs that direct people to specific resources on our site. One is the Rainbow Terps page, and another is our Trans Resources Guide, which I also believe we'll be expanding out to include not just the resources guide, but other things for the trans awareness campaign that we're currently building. There's also a website, mypronouns.org, where you can find a lot more details specifically about pronouns and pronoun issues. A few steps that you may want to take after this recording, after this session, is reviewing the recording and additional resources. Certainly, if you have questions, you may want to seek clarification, be mindful of language and behaviors. But we encourage you to come to visit the LGBT Equity Center. We're in 2218 Marie Mount Hall. We have some Rainbow Terp stickers that we could give you, and we encourage those to be displayed in different ways. That also helps create inclusive environments. And then there's additional learning opportunities that will ultimately get posted on the Rainbow Terps website. We'll also be emailing out an evaluation after this session, along with also a link to this recording and to the other recordings of the webinar sessions I had mentioned before. And so with that, I thank you.